This is Chernomorskaya, a village in Crimea. The video shows trenches on the beach. Similar fortifications have been set up in Armyansk by the Crimean Isthmus, while mine barriers are found near Molochny. Still more, rows of dragon teeth pyramids have been placed at the shores of Saki district. All across Crimea, Russian authorities are constructing new trenches, laying mines and setting up obstructions to repel a possible Ukrainian ground assault. These precautionary measures suggest that retaking Crimea is no longer a pipe dream. President Zelensky certainly thinks so, as recently as November 2022, he vowed to retake all occupied territories, including Crimea, and that is precisely what Ukrainians want. According to a Gallup poll released in October, 91% of Ukrainians believe that victory means recapturing all Ukrainian territories seized by Russia, including Crimea. So, how would this go down? Whatever the answer, judging by the new fortifications, one thing is for sure: Kiev is not the one worrying and stressing, rather it is the cause of worry and stress. America and its NATO allies are sending Ukraine the battle tanks it needs. The move is mired in controversy, and that's why I like ground news. It helps navigate the maze of misinformation. For example, the breaking story of Germany sending tanks to Ukraine has been covered by 304 sources around the world. On the ground news website, we can see all the headlines in one place to compare language, factuality data, political affiliation, and ownership of each source. Having this information in one place makes it easy to spot bias and misinformation in the media. As we'll explain later in this video, Ukraine relies on the Lend-Lease program, and Zelensky's subsequent request for ATACMS missiles and F-16 jets is also mirrored in disinformation. Looking at the biased distribution, only right-leaning sources are talking about missiles and warplanes for Ukraine. It's a total blind spot for left-leaning media outlets. You don't want to be caught off guard like this. For a more comprehensive perspective on all global and regional issues, go to ground.news/Caspian. And special thanks to Ground News for sponsoring this video. After 300 days of hostilities, Ukrainian troops have recaptured more than half the territory the Russians had occupied. Encouraged by battlefield victories, the momentum has shifted to Ukraine's side. So much so that some argue that the time is nigh to take back Crimea. Ukrainian forces have already attacked some targets in the area, including Saki Air Base, the Sevastopol Naval Base, and the Crimean Bridge. However, a full assault on the region would have a different meaning for Russia than bombing targets in Luhansk or Donetsk. Crimea is not just strategic real estate, it also holds a special place in Putin's credibility. Russians perceive its annexation in 2014 as Putin's single greatest achievement. Losing Crimea would thus be akin to Putin losing political power. But the fight for Crimea goes beyond politics, justice, sovereignty, or even history. Ultimately, it is about power projection. Since 2014, Russia has turned Crimea into a massive military base, brimming with anti-access area denial weapons. These armaments restrict the operational mobility of hostile forces by land, air, or sea. In fact, Crimea is precisely the reason why Russia's invasion of Ukraine has had more success in the south than anywhere else. Russia continues to use its air and naval bases in Crimea to launch missile and drone attacks deep within Ukrainian territory. And as long as Russia controls Crimea, Ukraine cannot be safe or even rebuild its economy. Coastal cities like Mariupol, Berdyansk, Melitopol, Kherson, Mykolaiv, and Odessa are surrounded by Russian weaponry and thus subject to Russian terms vis-à-vis maritime commerce. whoever holds Crimea will have the upper hand in the Black Sea and the Azov Sea. These two bodies of water are major shipping destinations for all kinds of commodities. Thus, by controlling Crimea, Russia decides who gets access to supplies like coal, grain, iron ore, fertilizers, industrial goods, and so on. Consider the global food crisis where Russia threatened shipping in the Black Sea and the Azov Sea. It is only by Turkey's intervention that the threat hasn't materialized. But Ukraine cannot indefinitely rely on the goodwill of others. It needs Crimea back if it is to rebuild its economy. So, the big question is then, how would Ukraine go about retaking the area? In an ideal world, it would be accomplished by diplomatic means. Eventually, Putin will pass and leave office, by natural cause or otherwise. His successor will inherit an isolated economy and face international litigation by Ukraine. Kiev would demand hundreds of billions of dollars in damages and is likely to win such a case. Western governments would abide by the international court's binding resolution by transferring Russia's frozen assets to the Ukrainian government. To deflect such an outcome, Russia's next executive office might offer to return Crimea to Ukraine as a negotiated deal. This is the scenario most Western analysts consider credible, but it is a fairy tale. Diplomacy is unlikely to yield any success. If Kiev wants Crimea back, it will need to do so by kinetic persuasion. But taking Crimea by force will not be easy. It will be the toughest fight in the war so far, more brutal than the counter-offensives in Kherson or Kharkiv. Casualties would pile up. Crimea's geography alone gives pause for thought. There are only so many ways to get into the peninsula, and even though Ukraine has shown ingenuity in sinking the Russian cruiser Moskva, it has nothing to match Russia's naval force or its anti-access area denial weapons. Russia has submarines, surface combat ships, and anti-aircraft systems in and around Crimea, while Ukraine lacks an airborne force or an amphibious force in significant numbers. This power gap means a large-scale operation by air or sea is off the table. This inconvenient truth leaves Ukraine with no other choice than a ground operation. However, the narrow isthmus connecting Crimea to the Ukrainian mainland makes it difficult to move troops into the peninsula. It's only about 5 to 7 kilometers wide, the terrain is flat and sparsely forested. The isthmus is a force multiplier. It condenses manpower and firepower, turning it into a killing zone. Before Ukraine can even consider an assault on Crimea, its troops must control the Kherson and Zaporozhye regions. This is easier said than done. Crossing the Dnieper River from Kherson would exhaust Ukrainian resources. Plus, the nearby bridges would have to be taken relatively intact so that supply lines can be extended. It might actually be easier to swoop down from the north into Zaporozhye, take Berdyansk, Melitopol, and then push into Nova Kharkovka and ride the adjacent highway to flank Kherson from the east. Once that is done, Ukraine can look to its southern tip. Protruding into the Black Sea, Crimea is a geographic fortress. Even before the massive military buildup in 2001, it had an estimated 31,000 Russian troops. Since then, its defenses have strengthened with new contingents and weapons. Russian positions in Crimea are better supplied than their counterparts in Donbass. So, the closer Ukrainian troops get to Crimea, the tougher the fight would get. It would become a grinding advance. Body bags would manure the soil underneath. Either way, proceeding from the Kherson direction, Ukrainian guided rocket systems could target Russian logistics like railways, ammunition depots, etc. The further south the Ukrainians can advance in Kherson, the more fire control they would gain over Russian positions in Crimea. One of the primary targets would be the Russian bridge over the Kerch Strait. It was partially damaged in October 2022, but this time Ukraine would need to finish the job and destroy it beyond repair. The success of this campaign will depend on the supply of American weapons as part of the Lend-Lease program. Ukraine would need howitzer systems, multiple rocket launchers, infantry fighting vehicles, and main battle tanks. One weapon in particular the Ukrainians have been lobbying for are ATACMS. These are 300-kilometer range missiles that would help Ukrainians hit targets deep inside Crimea. If supplied with ATACMS, Ukrainian contingents would gain maneuverability, and its troops could maintain a safe distance from Russian firepower, likely saving thousands of Ukrainian troops. Meanwhile, from the Zaporozhye direction, Ukrainian forces could try to advance in an area called Sivash, fittingly nicknamed the Rotten Sea. It sits east of the Crimean Isthmus. It has shallow lagoons, and during the low tide, ground forces can use it to cross into the peninsula. But the window to push through Sivash is short. During the winter, logistics freeze, while during the spring, the terrain turns into impassable mud. Powerhouses of the past used Sivash to march into Crimea, most recently by the Germans during World War II. To cross Sivash, the Ukrainians would need to conduct drone strikes on Russian warships while bringing down artillery firepower on Russian shoreline defenses. Russia's Black Sea Fleet is beyond Ukraine's league, but it is not indestructible. The fleet has an assault capacity of about 20 ships, all outdated and vulnerable to land and airborne strikes, which is precisely why they stay away from the Ukrainian coast. With enough drones and missiles, the Ukrainians could chip away at the Russian Navy in the coming months. Bayraktar drones and HIMARS rocket systems, a deadly duo when used in sync, would come in handy. Following months of bombardment, Russian defenses should be weakened enough for the Ukrainians to cross into the peninsula and establish a beachhead. It would be an operation with a lot of moving parts. The room for error would be small, and a lot would need to go right for the assault to work. Even so, massive losses would be unavoidable. To put things into perspective, in the 20th century, hundreds of thousands fell at the Crimean Isthmus, to say nothing of the casualties during the Crimean War of the 1850s. Ukraine would pay an exceedingly high price to restore its sovereignty. After successfully setting up a beachhead, Ukrainian troops could push inland into the peninsula. The remaining Russian forces would be trapped, leaving the Russian positions vulnerable to Ukrainian assault. Once inside, the battle for the peninsula would turn into an ordinary reclamation project, something the Ukrainian army has proven to be good at. After retaking Crimea, new complications would likely emerge, namely what to do with the ethnic Russian population. While there are pockets of pro-Russian communities in mainland Ukraine, the number is much higher in Crimea. The region has had a Russian majority since the ethnic cleansing of Crimean Tatars, which started about 2 centuries ago. Crimea's Russian population today is even higher than in 2014. Somewhere between 200,000 and 1 million Russians migrated from Russia to Crimea. The situation is entirely different than 9 years ago. Ukrainian troops entering Sevastopol may not be greeted with jubilation as in other Ukrainian cities. Nearly a decade of Russian state propaganda and bad-mouthing Ukraine will make it difficult for Kiev to integrate the Crimean population into the mainland. At worst, Ukrainian troops could come face to face with pro-Russian guerrilla fighters or face fallout from non-strategic nuclear weapons. The United States and NATO argue as much. Though the West has been united in the belief that the 2014 annexation of Crimea is unacceptable, they are hesitant to support Ukraine in taking Crimea by force. Many policymakers in the West fear an attack on Crimea would result in nuclear retaliation and that Ukraine should give it up in exchange for peace. Whatever Kiev decides, the realpolitik is that so long as Russia controls Crimea, it will have the capacity to launch military operations at the time of its choosing. Crimea's strategic position permits as much. And though the Ukrainians still need to win many more battles first, Zelensky said it best: "Everything began in Crimea, and everything will end in Crimea." I've been your host Shirvan from Caspian Report. If you appreciate our content but you want more, consider joining our Patreon platform. The PDF for this episode is actually longer than the video, with additional information on the history of Crimea. You can access our PDFs and other perks by joining the Patreon platform or the YouTube membership program. Thank you for watching, and Sağ ol.